We are back, and we are joined now by Lily Greenberg Call, former special assistant to the chief of staff at the Department of the Interior under the Biden administration. Lily resigned over Biden's support for the genocide in Gaza. Lily, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, I wanted to have you on today to talk about and we can update the audience on one of the gravest crimes against our First Amendment perpetrated by our government. I don't know that we've seen this century. The detention of Mahmoud Khalil over his activism opposing the genocide in Gaza at Columbia. And I wanted to first begin by getting your reaction as somebody who worked under a Democratic administration to two separate statements by Senate Democrats. The first is Chuck Schumer's statement, which begins by basically condemning Khalil. Do we have that, Matt? I sent that to you over DM, but I can start reading it here from my computer. So Chuck Schumer's statement begins, "I abhor many of the opinions and policies that Mahmoud Khalil holds and supports, and have made my criticism of the anti-Semitic actions at Columbia loudly known. Mr. Khalil's..." But so this is how he begins his statement, essentially, by falsely linking him to anti-Semitic actions without fully saying it, and abhorring his opinions as if this is what's important here, and as if he's saying anything controversial. And now let's compare this to Chris Murphy's statement, the senator from Connecticut, who I think is really stepping up to the plate in many ways here. We might not be aligned on every policy, but this is why Chris Murphy is my pick, really, for the next leader for the Senate Democrats. I'm throwing that out there here because this is somebody who understands how to fight Republicans in this era, and this is a much more appropriate way to react to this grave First Amendment violation.
A young man by the name of Mahmoud Khalil, an immigrant and a legal permanent resident of the United States, is being held right now in prison, even though no criminal charges have been filed against him. Now, I want to tell you why that should matter to every single American. Khalil is a recent graduate of Columbia University. He opposed Israel's military operation in Gaza. He has deep animus toward Israel's policies and the U.S. support for those policies. He helped organize the protests over Gaza at his university last year. You can disagree with his views or his politics, but there is no evidence he has broken any law. But last weekend, Trump officials entered his apartment and took him into custody. They brought him to a detention facility in New Jersey at first, but when his family went to visit him, he wasn't there. For a while, his family and his lawyer had no idea where he was. They eventually found out that he was being held in a detention facility in Louisiana, and that's where he still is today. In dictatorships, they call this practice being disappeared. No charges, no claims of criminal behavior. The White House doesn't claim he did anything criminal. He's in jail because of his political speech. And here's why everybody should care. In America, your political speech is protected, whether or not the president likes what you say. But today, if you're loyal to Donald Trump, your speech is going to be protected, even if it's hate speech. You can be Marco Ellis, an employee of Doge, who said he, quote, was racist before it was cool, and, quote, normalize Indian hate. And the vice president of the United States will tweet in your defense. But if you are disloyal to Trump, or you're organizing against Trump's political agenda, your speech could be criminalized. You could find yourself in jail. Now, Trump chose to begin by disappearing a Palestinian immigrant, hoping that his place of birth and his immigrant status would just cause people to look the other way. But we cannot, because
there's more to that statement, but I think that's a great piece of it. What a contrast. And Lily, just your reaction to seeing the different ways that powerful Democrats in our government are reacting.
I think Murphy's statement is excellent, and I think it is what Democrats need to be doing right now, right? They need to be unequivocal in calling this out for what it is, which is a politically motivated abduction of an activist for his speech, right? They should be pressing the Trump administration to release Mahmoud immediately, to halt this crackdown. And we need more Dems to be speaking out like Chris Murphy. It's a problem that people like Schumer and Jeffries are spending more time throat clearing about how they abhor Mahmoud's positions before saying that they believe in the First Amendment and how that applies to every single person in this country, regardless of if they like what they're saying or not.
And there is no evidence that Mahmoud said anything that would, I mean, not that it even would matter. He can say whatever he wants. He could have said deeply anti-Semitic things, and this would still be an illegal detention. But the reality is that we know that the Trump administration engages in anti-Semitism all the time. Just yesterday, Trump said that Chuck Schumer is no longer a Jew, he's Palestinian. Which is something he's repeatedly said, but he hadn't gone the extra step to do what he basically was more explicit about this time, which is saying that he's a bad Jew. As if Donald Trump, who said there were both many people, good people on both sides of the Charlottesville Nazi rally, as if he has any leg to stand on about anti-Semitism. Just your reaction. And I should say, Lily, you were the first, I believe, a Jewish staffer in the Biden administration to resign over his Gaza policy.
Yeah, I mean, first, just to address what you said before too, like there is no evidence that Mahmoud Khalil has espoused support for Hamas, and I think it's so upsetting that any support for Palestinian human rights is equated to support for terrorism, right? I mean, and if we even want to go there, like there's a quote that's being spread around the Jewish community right now, actually, of Mahmoud saying, I think last spring, that Palestinian and Jewish liberation are connected, and that he deeply believes that, and I think that's that. It's just indicative of how, right, you're right. I mean, it doesn't quite matter. These people are not actually interested in protecting Jews. None of this is about protecting Jews. If anything, it's another way that they're weaponizing anti-Semitism to justify fascism. And it's placing our community as the face of Trump's fascist crackdown on speech that he doesn't like. The White House tweeting out Shalom Mahmoud over a picture of him does nothing to solve anti-Semitism. And if anything, it makes Jews less safe. It's going to breed resentment of Jews to take away people's rights in our name. It's a crackdown on free speech, and it's not about fighting anti-Semitism. And turning Palestinian into a slur, like Trump has done, is just another clear attack on Palestinians and the movement for Palestinian human rights and freedom, and on any Jewish people or non-Jewish people who support that.
Can you react even more to what you just said about that tweet saying Shalom Mahmoud? I find the idea that this administration is invoking Judaism as they use, frankly, there was an article in Wired, by the way, that said that explained what they're using, the statute. They're using this INA piece of legislation. I'm trying to find the abbreviated version. I will in a second. But it was sponsored during the height of the McCarthy era by McCarthyites in the 50s. And it was also targeted against Jews. As we know, the Red Scare was also deeply anti-Semitic. So the fact that they're saying shalom that way and using Zionist state repression to equivocate that with Judaism, that's one of the most anti-Semitic things I've seen a government official openly engage in, and it was from the White House account.
Yeah, I mean, the whole story of Mahmoud was so. It's the stuff of nightmares, right? It's to be disappeared with no warrant, without access to lawyers, not telling his wife or lawyers where he is. And those are the stories that I grew up hearing as a young Jewish person from my ancestors and people in my community about what it was like for us as Jewish people to live under authoritarian regimes in the old country, right? People picked up at night, stolen from their families, their whereabouts unknown. So then to see that happen, and then to see something so abhorrent like that tweet, I mean, it's disgusting. It's so personally offending. And honestly, I think it's like a deep miscalculation in some ways by Trump and his Christian nationalist buddies, because a broad swath of American Jews are furious about this abduction, and they're furious about the way Trump is blaming this abduction on Jews. Of course, we're seeing progressive Jewish organizations speak out, but we're also seeing organizations like the Jewish Center for Public Affairs and mainstream rabbis at synagogues across the country, Jewish politicians, a Jewish Federation in Michigan, calling this out for what it is, which is a fascist crackdown on freedom of expression. And I think it's so, this has crossed such a line for so many people, and it's such a, it's just so clear that it's so anti-Semitic to blame, to justify the disappearance of a person and a complete violation of their First Amendment rights by saying, this is because we care about Jews and anti-Semitism. And again, taking away people's rights and taking away people's jobs and livelihoods, right, with this crackdown on the education system and everything that they're doing, and blaming it on Jews or claiming to do it on behalf of Jews is going to create resentment towards Jews, which is intentional, which is also what they want, because they would rather people blame Jews than blame them.
Right. Or question U.S. foreign policy. And so they're much more willing to drum up anti-Semitism for that purpose. Here is one of Mahmoud's lawyers who was on Democracy Now! This morning. His name is Ramzi Qasem. And Amy Goodman has a great question for him about that statute that's being used very flimsily by the Trump administration to detain Mahmoud. And he explains, the history of this piece of legislation and how it has previously been used even for explicitly anti-Semitic purposes.
With the Palestinian people.
The government is trying to deport Mahmoud based on a rarely used provision of federal immigration law that allows the Secretary of State to remove individuals whose presence it believes has potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences for the United States, unquote. Can you explain this extremely rare provision? The only previous time it was used before was in 1995, according to recent press reports. According to the New York Times, that was an attempt to deport a former Mexican government official. Ironically, the judge who struck it down as unconstitutional in 1996 was Marianne Trump Barry, President Trump's sister, who was a federal judge in New Jersey. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, so that provision has, an interesting history, to say the least. It's a provision that is now understood to have been enacted primarily to target Eastern European Jewish Holocaust survivors who came to the United States and were suspected, often wrongly suspected, of being Soviet agents. So that's the origin story of this particular piece of federal legislation. And that origin story is the reason why Congress came back in and amended it, saying, well, you can't use this law to punish people for their views and their speech. And if you want to do that, then it requires, a personal certification by the Secretary of State for why that person's presence and their speech poses a compelling risk to U.S. foreign policy interests. And it also requires the Secretary of State to notify Congress with supporting evidence for why they're making this move. So it is an exceedingly rarely used provision. And it certainly does not trump the Constitution and Mr. Khalil's First Amendment rights.
So,
just a fascinating piece of context. And you see how, well, first of all, Donald Trump being a student of Roy Cohn, who was somebody who pushed for the execution of the Rosenbergs in the Red Scare, which was also anti-Semitic. Cohn was, trying to I guess he was very anti-Semitic despite his background. I'm very anti-gay despite being gay. Anyway, but you can see how the targeting of specific groups under the guise of cracking down on communists or leftists, or in this instance, I mean, the modern Zionist crackdown is a McCarthyite one. History is really rhyming here, and they're using anti-Semitism to justify it in this instance, while also drumming up anti-Semitism.
Exactly, which is actually a real manifestation of how anti-Semitism happens historically. It is usually a part of this cycle of both using it and blaming Jews, but also drumming up using Jews as kind of a cover for the ruling class's actions. And I think, this is really why American Jews need to be making sure that our synagogues and our federations and our Hillels and all of our Jewish institutions are speaking out unequivocally against this. We need to be fighting for Mahmoud as if he is one of our own, because he is one of our own. And we as Jews know where this kind of thing leads. And we cannot allow that to happen here in the United States, because this is a test case, right? This is they're testing how much they can get away with this, right? As Chris Murphy said, and as I said before, they abducted someone who they think politicians and the public will not have a lot of sympathy for and will look away. And they're not going to stop there, right? They're going to go after anyone who advocates for anything that the MAGA regime is against, for reproductive justice, for climate action, for migrant justice. We need to make sure that the regime loses. And American Jews, I believe, my community needs to be on the forefront of that, of fighting that.
And lastly, Lily, how would you recommend folks get involved here in terms of just what are the paths for activists who don't just want to free Mahmoud, but want to kind of be a bulwark against the very authoritarian actions that this administration is going to engage in, the ones that you describe?
I mean, people need to be in the streets, right? I think there's been some really wonderful actions right now, and clear, like people taking to the streets in New York and DC, and I know in Louisiana outside of the detention center where Mahmoud is being held. But both people in power and regular everyday Americans need to be showing up. This isn't a time to think, oh, someone else is going to go, right? It needs to be you, and you need to bring your community and your kids and your neighbors, and particularly right within, I was saying within the American Jewish community, we need to make sure that our institutions are speaking out against this, but I think that applies to other people and other communities as well. And this is really clear, right? Like, you don't have to agree with what someone is saying to understand that such an explicit violation of our First Amendment rights is an attack on all of us. And if we don't fight back, then we're not going to have much to fight for.
Well, I really appreciate your time today, Lily. Greenberg Call. Lily resigned from the Department of the Interior under Biden over his support for the genocide in Gaza. Thanks so much for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Emma. Take care.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.